Hello, y'all. Welcome to lesson 81 of my DP chemistry curriculum. Today we're going over reactivity 2.2.2 and 2.2.3. So, with that said, reactivity 2.2.2 covers how species react as a result of collisions of sufficient energy and proper orientation. We will explain the relationship between kinetic energies of particles and temperature in Kelvin and the role of collision geometry. Furthermore, in 2.2.3, we're going to cover factors that influence the rate of reaction, which include pressure, concentration, surface area, temperature, and the presence of a catalyst, so that later we can predict and explain the effects of changing conditions on the rate of reaction. It's quite a few things, but we can cover it without too much trouble. So before we even get into this, we need to talk about how reactions react. What is actually happening? Well, for that, we need to move into what's called collision theory. Collision theory basically states that for any reaction to occur, let's get that set. For any reaction, particles need to have enough energy and collide with the proper orientation. So let's break those two things down real quick. Um, let's first start with enough energy. For enough energy, that's kind of something that we really have to think about. When we have a reaction, so in a reaction, what we really know is that bonds in reactants break. We learned that when we talked about enthalpy changes and calculating the changes in enthalpy in a reaction. So bonds in reactants break. Then following that, bonds form in products. And these processes have different aspects to them. Well, the whole reaction itself can be endothermic or exothermic. To break a bond, that's always endothermic. And to form a bond, that's always exothermic. So something about this, maybe the amount of endothermic versus the amount of exothermic, that's kind of what's going to determine the overall endo or exothermic of the reaction. But we really have this initial point where we always need to first add some energy. So this is what we call activation energy. Activation energy is the minimum energy that is required to start a reaction. And so when we say enough energy, like we do right up here, well, what do we actually mean? We mean that the energy of reactants, reactants. So the energy of the reactants is going to be greater than or equal to the activation energy. So once we achieve that energy, our reaction can begin. All right. So that out of the way, let's really talk about what we mean by energy as well as what we mean by orientation. So let's talk about kinetic energy. And related to kinetic energy as the average kinetic energy, we'll talk about temperature. So kinetic energy and temperature. When we increase temperature, what we're actually going to end up having to do is increase the kinetic energy. So an increase in temperature is related to an increase or proportional to an increase in kinetic energy. If we have an increase in kinetic energy, which we know is 1/2 mv squared, the particles aren't gaining more mass. What's actually happening is particles move faster. which can affect two things. If they move faster, they are going to collide more often. I talked about this in a previous video where if you imagine a bunch of particles as a bunch of children moving around in a room in random directions, and I think I talked about this in terms of pressure, if we increase the temperature, they move faster. If they're moving faster, these children are more likely to hit each other. Just frankly, by moving so much faster, they start colliding way more often. And so faster particles will collide more often. Furthermore, according to what we just talked about, if we have a higher temperature, we have a higher energy, which means that energy is more likely to be above our activation energy. Now, something that we need to be particular about, and I'm going to write it out here, is at higher temps, what we're really saying is that we are more likely to have particles with energy greater than or equal to activation energy. What I mean by this is that in a container or in a sample, even though one child might be moving super fast all around, the other child might be moving a little slower, and another child might be moving somewhere in between. Temperature is average kinetic energy, meaning that particles are moving faster or slower than others. But what this means is at a higher temperature, there are going to be more fast particles, and those more fast particles are more likely to have that greater energy. It doesn't mean all particles are, it just means that a larger proportion of particles in a solution or in a container are going to have energy achieving higher than the activation energy. So that's what we talk about enough energy. What do we mean by orientation? So this is what we refer to as collision geometry, and it's really quite simple. For reactions, particles must collide in proper orientation. So reactions don't work in every way. You can think of particles as Lego bricks. And if I have a little Lego brick here, and I duplicate it, these two can come together and connect. We know Legos work like that. But if I take a second Lego brick, I don't want to grab that green arrow. We'll duplicate this one. But this one, we're going to rotate around. These Lego bricks will not connect. That's because they don't have the correct orientation. You can think of particles very much the same way. Generally, you can think about particles as Legos in all of this. In fact, for Legos to work, they both need to be connected, but you also need to add that pressure. You need to apply a force to connect them. Just sitting on top of each other, they won't link up. So that's very true for our particles. That activation energy is that energy required to push the Legos together. Furthermore, when we talk about this initial energy as well, to break the bonds, you have to first apply energy to pull two Legos apart. Anyways, that is collision theory. Now we can move to factors that affect rate. That affect rate. So now that we know how particles interact to react, how can we actually change that? Well, the first and most obvious we already talked about. That's temperature. So we already stated this, but an increased temperature is going to relate to an increase in frequency of collisions as well as, and I'm going to change color for this, a higher probability of particles having energy greater than or equal to our activation energy. Now, out of these two factors, I'm going to tell you right now that this is the far more important one. It is much more relevant to have greater energy than it is to collide. The particles in a solution will collide naturally, and having the right amount of energy is more important than them colliding in the first place. Well, more important than colliding more often. We want those collisions to be successful. We want them to be what's considered effective collisions. With that in mind, let's take a look. So I'm going to just say more important. With that in mind, let's look at how we actually define rate, or how we actually figure out the general idea of rate. So you can think of rate as the collision frequency times the fraction of effective collisions. Effective collisions. So effective collisions is going to refer to both orientation and energy. Orientation and energy. Sorry for that horrendous E right there. And once again, as I mentioned right there with temperature, that's the more important one. We focus more on having more effective collisions. That's going to have a greater effect on rate than just a higher frequency of collisions. But anything that can alter this equation will alter the rate. So increase in temperature increases both of these and therefore increases the rate. Decrease in temperature would decrease both of these and therefore decrease the rate. So what we're going to do is apply every single change to this equation and see what comes up. All right, other than temperature, we can increase concentration. Or sorry, a factor that changes it is concentration. I usually talk about increases, but these just work vice versa for decreases in this sense too. So an increase in concentration, which concentration is just a measure of particles per volume. So if I increase the number of particles, what we're going to do is we're going to increase frequency of collisions. More particles means more collisions, and therefore this is increasing this aspect right here. And therefore, because we've increased collision frequency, we'll increase rate. If we decrease concentration, we decrease rate. So what I want to go over with this is just two examples that you might see in the DP curriculum or on a DP exam. So we can take a look at an acid plus a carbonate, which is going to produce CO2 gas, as well as a couple other things, depending. But you might look at two graphs. Sorry, you might see two types of graphs shown when you get this type of reaction. And we'll take it as volume of CO2 produced. And our x-axis will be time. Let me just copy this graph over. So you'll generally see two forms of this. First, we'll have this reaction, and then we might have this reaction, which might be compared to this reaction, oops, versus this reaction. So in this case, the purple is always going to be our less concentrated acid. The light blue is going to be the more concentrated. And what this graph is showing is actually two different aspects of the same idea. You'll notice that we have different volumes produced, while here we have the same volume produced. In this case, we are looking at where acid is a limiting factor. If we have a more concentrated acid and it is the limiting reagent, by adding more acid, or more volume of the same, or more of the same volume of different concentrations, we will have an increase in gas production. If our carbonate is our limiting, no matter how fast our reaction progresses, we're still going to end at the same volume because carbonate is limiting. So just be aware that both of these can occur. So right here, this is our acid is limiting reactant. And then to write carbonate, I'm just going to duplicate that and delete the word acid. Carbonate is our limiting reactant. So it may not be an acid carbonate, but here we can just see that the rates change as well as the products or amount of products change. All right, there are three more things that affect rate. Next is pressure. This one's quite simple. This is for gaseous solutions or gaseous reactions. So for a gas, if we increase pressure, what we're really just doing is increasing frequency of collisions. So pressure is going to affect the frequency of those collisions. Therefore, it's going to affect rate. Surface area, this one works for reactions with different phases, like a solid and a liquid. So if you have a reaction with two different phases, like maybe putting an Alka-Seltzer tablet or a fizzy tablet in water, or just dissolving sugar in water, salt in water, generally when you crush it up, you increase the surface area. And increase in surface area is equal to an increase in frequency of collisions. A really great way of seeing this is if you have two beakers that are identical. So quickly make some identical beakers. And we put a particle in there. The water, or whatever the solution is, only reacts on the outside. The inside of the particle is not going to react because it's still touching other insides of the particle. If we, however, cut this particle in half, now we expose another entire side to it that the liquid can interact with. And so by increasing the surface area, we are increasing the amount of area that particles can react. We are increasing the frequency of those collisions. So another way that this is often represented in the DP curriculum is instead of saying an increase in surface area, they'll often say a decrease in particle size, which you'll notice is exactly what we did. We went from a full particle size to two half particle sizes. So a decrease in particle size is just parlance for increasing the surface area, therefore increasing the frequency of collisions, and therefore increasing the rate. All right, our last one is called a catalyst. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that on almost every DP test, I have seen the phrase or the question, what is a catalyst and or how does it work? I'm telling you right now, and I tell all my students this, you must memorize this phrase. I feel like I'm teaching to a test because I am, but memorize this phrase. A catalyst increases the rate of reaction by providing an alternative reaction pathway So that's the first part of it that requires a lower activation energy. So a catalyst, all it does is allows the particles to react with a lower activation energy. So it does something that allows the particles to not need as much energy input to react. By doing so, if we go all the way back up to the top, catalyst is one of the only things that also increases the effectiveness or the fraction of effective collisions because temperature does it by increasing the energy, but none of our other things do that. All our other factors affect collision frequency, but catalysts will affect this. It specifically lowers the activation energy. It makes it easier for reactions to work. There are a couple key things we need to know about catalysts. The first is they are not consumed in reactions. Furthermore, catalysts are specific, meaning each reaction could have its own specific catalyst. The last thing that we often have to know is that enzymes, which are a type of protein, all enzymes are proteins, but not all proteins are enzymes, um, are examples of biological enzymes. Of biological enzymes. Our bodies often do so many processes that require breaking things down and building things up. That's what metabolism is. It's the anabolism and catabolism of all the different foods and nutrients that our body takes in and puts out. And enzymes allow us to do those reactions better. For example, lactase is the enzyme that breaks down milk. So, for example, or lactose in milk. Lactase is an enzyme. It helps break lactose. Generally, biological enzymes are noted by the ACE, ASE, just like sugars are usually noted by OSE, OSE. So these are enzymes. Other examples might be helicase, DNA polymerase. Literally anything with an ACE is going to break down something. It is an enzyme that is going to catalyze the reaction of the breakdown of something or possible building of something. Anyways, these are all the different ways you can affect rate. Hopefully this helps and have a great day.